The snow came down like ash over Whispering Pine Ranch the night Caleb Ashford finally rode home, and for a long moment he sat frozen in his saddle at the edge of the gate, certain he had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the dark, because the place he remembered had been a grave of broken fences and silent barns, and the place in front of him now was breathing with light. Smoke curled thick and steady from 3 chimneys instead of 1. Lantern glow spilled gold across a freshly mended fence line. Somewhere past the barn a dog barked and a child laughed, and Caleb Ashford, a man who had crossed 1,000 miles of hard frontier and buried his fear so deep he no longer recognized it as fear, felt his chest tighten with something close to dread, because the last time he had seen this ranch, he had left a dying woman inside it and ridden away certain he would never see her alive again. 3 years is a long time to carry the weight of a decision a man is ashamed of, and Caleb had carried his all the way from Montana to the Dakotas and back, through cattle drives and government contracts and every kind of hard men the frontier could offer. There had been nights on the open plain, wrapped in a thin bedroll under a sky too big for comfort, when he could not sleep for thinking of her, when he told himself he would send a letter in the morning, and never did, when his own silence felt less like mercy and more like cowardice dressed up in practical language. He had told himself it was kindness, leaving her to the mountain air instead of watching her die in front of him. He had told himself a great many things over 3 years, and none of them had ever made the guilt sit any lighter in his chest, especially on the coldest nights, when he wondered if she was already gone and he simply had not been told. He swung down from his horse at the gate and led it slowly up the gravel road, past pine trees that had not been there when he left, or perhaps had simply been buried so long under neglect that he had never noticed them living. And with every step, the warmth of the place pressed harder against the cold place inside him, until he reached the porch and the door opened before he even raised his hand to knock. Martha O'Donnell stood there, older now, her apron dusted with flour, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a ghost they were not expecting and did not particularly wish to see. She did not shame him, she simply stepped aside and let him in, and the smell that met him was rosemary and wood smoke and fresh bread, and somewhere beyond the kitchen he heard laughter that did not belong to strangers, it belonged to a family, and he understood in that instant that whatever this place had become, he had played no part in building it. He had built cattle contracts, someone else had built this. He found her in the study with the ranch ledgers spread before her on the desk, a lantern burning low, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and ink staining 2 of her fingers, deep in conversation with Ben Carter about spring irrigation, as though she had been born into ranch work instead of married blind into it. She was thinner than he remembered, but there was no fragility left in her, only a kind of quiet strength that seemed to come from the ground itself, the strength of a woman who had learned to survive on her own terms and had stopped waiting for permission to live. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway with snow still melting in his hair, she did not gasp, did not rush to him, did not weep with relief the way he had. Half expected, half feared, she simply set down her pen. Caleb heard his own voice come out smaller than he intended. "You're alive," he said, as if she might not have noticed. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice was calm and even, without cruelty, but without warmth either. "I've found better things to do than die," she said, and went back to her ledgers. And Caleb Ashford, who had negotiated with railroad men and outlasted blizzards on the open plain, found he had no answer for that at all.
He learned the truth of what happened in pieces over the following weeks, gathered from Martha's careful stories and Ben's gruff asides and Lucy Bennett's warmer memories shared over kitchen bread. He learned that the first winter had nearly killed Eleanor exactly as everyone predicted, that there had been nights of fever so high Martha sat up praying by candlelight, nights of coughing that left blood on the pillow and left the household certain each morning would bring a burial instead of breakfast. But something had shifted in Eleanor when spring finally broke through the frost, some quiet decision made alone in a cold room that no one else witnessed, and she had risen from that sickbed with a resolve that surprised even herself, a decision that if death was coming for her someday, it would not find her waiting uselessly inside a house for a husband who had already written her off. She had moved into the smallest room in the house because it was easier to heat, closed off the wings she could not afford to keep warm, and turned her attention outward, toward the accounts nobody had balanced in years, toward the fences nobody had mended, toward the empty barns that could hold livestock instead of dust. She had planted herbs where flowers might have grown, because herbs could be sold and flowers could not, and she had spent long, painful afternoons on her knees in dirt, despite lungs that fought her every breath, because vegetables in the ground in spring meant food on the table in winter. Martha became the mother Eleanor had never had, and Ben, gruff, cold Ben, who had buried a wife and 2 sons of his own years before, became her teacher in all things cattle and horse, though he would have died before admitting how much he had come to care for the girl he taught. One particular evening stayed with Caleb long after he first heard of it, and later, when Lucy retold it in full, he understood why. It had been the ranch's second Christmas under Eleanor's quiet management, a lean year with little money for gifts, and Eleanor had spent weeks after everyone else was asleep, seated close to a single candle, knitting blankets from wool she had traded her own mother's brooch to afford, one for every hand on the ranch, stitched late into the night with fingers that ached from the cold and the work both. On Christmas morning, she had risen before dawn and left each blanket folded neatly at the foot of a bunk, with no name attached, no note, nothing to mark where it came from, because she did not want gratitude, only warmth given quietly. Ben found his that morning, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, turning the wool over in his rough hands, and for a long while he simply sat there in silence before the tears came, unbidden and unstoppable, because in all his hard years on the frontier, burying a wife, burying
2 sons, working land that never once seemed to love him back, no one had ever given him a Christmas gift before. Year by year, the ranch had grown around Eleanor's quiet determination, the way new wood grows around an old wound, and the broken fences became strong again, and the barns filled with healthy stock, and fruit trees rose where there had only been frozen dirt, until Whispering Pine, once the loneliest and most forgotten property in the territory, became known across the county as the warmest home for 100 miles, a place where no traveler, however poor or strange, was ever turned away hungry. Caleb tried, in the weeks after his return, to step into the role of master of the ranch, the position his father's will had always intended for him, but he found there was no room for a master in a house that had learned to run itself on trust and shared labor, and so instead of demanding his place, he set his pride aside and took the bunkhouse instead of the main house, rose before sunrise to cut firewood alongside men who did not yet trust him, mended wagons and rebuilt fences with his own hands, and slowly, without announcement, began trying to earn back a place in a family he had never truly been part of. It was not a fast forgiveness.
Eleanor remained polite to him in the way a person is polite to a stranger they do not wish to offend, distant in a manner more painful to Caleb than anger would have been, because anger at least would have meant she still felt something sharp about him, and this quiet politeness felt instead like a door closed so gently he could not even find the seam to force it open. One evening, months into his return, he found her alone on the porch, watching the sun fall behind the pines, and he finally said the words he had been carrying since the night he first saw her alive again. "I am sorry," he told her, and meant it in every part of himself. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long while before she spoke. "I already learned how to build a life without you," she said, not cruelly, simply honestly, and those 9 words landed on Caleb harder than any hardship the frontier had ever thrown at him, because they were true. He resolved then to give her nothing less than patience, and he stayed through the long work of another Montana autumn, through ordinary days that slowly began to feel less like penance and more like belonging. As the next winter approached, Martha began to notice small things she did not mention at first: a cough that lingered a little too long after supper, a tiredness in Eleanor's step by evening that had not been there in the fall, a paleness that crept in slowly enough to be excused as nothing more than the season. Eleanor herself said little of it, waving away Martha's worried glances, insisting she had simply not slept well, and even Caleb, watching her more closely now than he ever had before, told himself it was only the cold air catching in her chest the way it always had. But the signs did not pass. They gathered quietly, the way snow gathers before a storm breaks, until one night, as wind screamed against the windows and the temperature dropped harder than it had in years, the illness that had haunted her first winter returned in full force, and Eleanor collapsed into Caleb's arms in the hallway, her breath shallow and rattling, her skin burning with fever. Caleb Ashford, who had once ridden away from this house believing her death was inevitable and none of his concern, now refused with every fiber of himself to let it happen while he still had breath to stop it. He wrapped her in every blanket the house could offer, called for Ben to saddle the strongest horse they had, and rode out into the storm with Eleanor held tight against his chest, the two of them pressing through drifts that reached the horse's flank, the wind cutting sideways with such force that twice he had to dismount and lead the animal on foot through the worst of it, half carrying Eleanor himself when the horse could go no further through the deepest snow, refusing to stop despite the cold burning through his gloves, until at last, exhausted and half frozen, he saw the frontier doctor's lamp burning faint in a window ahead. The doctor took one look at Eleanor's blue lips and Caleb's frost-bitten hands and said only, "Another hour, and she would have been beyond saving." Caleb sat outside that door through the rest of the night, with his head in his frozen hands, praying for the first time in years, promising anything, everything, if only she would be allowed to live. She did live. Recovery took the better part of the winter, slow and uncertain at first, but steady. And through every long week of it, Caleb never left her side, gave up every contract and opportunity that had once defined him without a second thought, because he had finally understood, in the coldest night of his life, that a man's success means nothing at all if there is no one waiting at home to share it with. By the time spring came again, something between them had changed that no words needed to explain. A quiet trust rebuilt, not through apology, but through years of shared work and one desperate night in the snow. Years passed, and Whispering Pine grew into one of the finest ranches in the territory, its fences strong, its barns full, its table always set for one more guest than expected. On a quiet evening long after that terrible winter, Caleb sat on the porch in the fading light, carving a small wooden rocking horse for their daughter, a little girl with her mother's steady eyes, who looked up from where she sat at Eleanor's feet and asked with the plain honesty only a child can manage, "Mama, is it true Papa left you right after your wedding?" Eleanor glanced toward Caleb, who had gone still over his carving, waiting, and she smiled, soft and unhurried, before she answered her daughter. "No, sweetheart," she said. "He just took the long road home." Caleb heard every word of it, and when he looked up, their eyes met across the porch in the last light of evening, and neither of them needed to say anything more, because the home around them, the fences he had mended, the fields she had planted, the family they had built out of abandonment and forgiveness both, said everything that mattered far better than words ever could. If this story moved you tonight, if you found yourself holding your breath through that storm or wiping your eyes at that porch, do not scroll past without hitting subscribe, because Desert Heart exists for hearts just like yours, hearts that still believe love is proven in the staying, not the leaving. Ring the bell so you never miss the next story of quiet courage on the American heartland.
Frontier. And if Eleanor's strength touched you, tell us in the comments below, because every story we tell is for viewers exactly like you. Whispering Pine's tale reflects real truths about frontier life in the 1880s American West, where marriages of necessity were common. Illness like tuberculosis or consumption was a genuine death sentence with no reliable cure, and survival on remote ranches depended entirely on resourcefulness, community, and labor rather than wealth alone. The story honors the quiet, undocumented strength of frontier women who managed land, livestock, and households while facing both isolation and illness. And it reflects on themes of earned forgiveness, humility, and the idea that true partnership is built through consistent action over time, rather than grand gestures.